Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program's Seminar Series podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Are we going to get started? Hi, let's go ahead and get started. We don't lose any time. We have a very stimulating speaker today.
That's great.
I'm Hannah Riley Bowles. I'm the research director here at the Women in Public Policy Program, which gives me the privilege of hosting this seminar, which has been absolutely terrific this year, and I'm very excited about today's speaker. Here at WAPPP, we are focused on closing gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, health, and education. I always forget, but I'm going to learn to remember to say that please keep in mind that today's seminar is being recorded by a podcast, but the good news is that it's going to be posted on the website. I'm going to say that at the front from now on, because I always lose track thinking about our speaker. And so we're really delighted to have Professor Elisabeth Prügl here. She is Professor of International Relations at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, very famous institute there. We're blessed to have her here as a fellow with us this year. She also, at the Graduate Institute, she heads the research program on gender and global change, which is an important hub for talking about gender and international relations and development. And her work, Professor Prügl's work, focuses on gender politics and global governance and feminism in international relations. And we've talked a bit ahead of time. She's got a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to follow the process of she's going to present, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming
Thank you for this introduction, Hannah, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my ongoing research. This is actually work I'm doing here currently at WAPPP. And so what you're getting is a glimpse of where I am right now, which is not the end and it's not the beginning, but what I really am open to is a lot of hopefully really good feedback. The title of this talk is Feminism, Triumphant, and Tamed, the Politics of Knowledge in Gender and Development. If I would redo the title, which was done many, many months ago, I would say The Politics of Knowledge in the World Bank, because that's really what I'm going to be talking about. There is today apparently, gender seems to be everywhere. In particular in the economic arena. We have the economists talk about womenomics, we have Nike talk about the girl effect, we have...
Could you speak up a little bit? It's a little hard to understand in the back.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
We have the World Economic Forum taking on gender issues and gender gaps as a matter that needs to be attacked. We have WAPPP taking on gender gaps. I hadn't had that in my list yet. We have Coca-Cola, Unilever, Goldman Sachs, all getting into the game of addressing gender equality issues. And we have the World Bank talking about gender equality being smart economics. So apparently what has happened is that feminism has triumphed. Feminists have been asking for this to happen for many, many years, for mainstream organizations, for governments, for international organizations to take gender equality seriously and to start to do something about it. So at the same time, though, and I'm forgetting my slides, we have feminists complaining, and feminists always complain. That's part of what we call critique, right? So what's the complaint? The complaint is that feminism really has been co-opted into these governance institutions and into global capitalism. It's no longer critiquing it, but it's supporting the expansion of capitalism. It supports existing power relations. Feminism has been neoliberalized. We're talking about neoliberalized feminism, free market feminism, transnational business feminism. There's all kinds of literature coming up around that. Nancy Fraser has suggested that feminism has spawned what she calls a neoliberal bastard, a strange, shadowy version of itself, an uncanny double that it can neither simply embrace nor wholly disavow. So that's my starting point. And my starting point is really to say that if I paint this very extreme, and I put people in boxes, and people always think much more complicated than when somebody presents their work. But in a sense, I think both of these arguments are actually wrong. They're both wrong because, on the one hand, I think that those who celebrate feminism as having triumphed naively disregard that any governance project is embedded in power relations. And so when we put feminism into governance institutions, it should not surprise us that there is a power politics going on. It also is naive, I think, on the part of feminists who decry these, because I think they have a vision of some kind of a pure feminism that has existed in the past. Feminism has always historically embedded in the United States. It's always been predominantly liberal, maybe not in other countries, but it has been. So in a sense, saying, well, this is not the right feminism any longer is actually naive. So I could just stop here, and say, I mean, this is all matters of ideology and let's forget about it. But I think what the interesting part about looking at this issue is to actually interrogate it empirically. And that's what I'm trying to do in this project of looking inside development organizations and see how does this politics of knowledge, what actually does it do, what does it produce? And so my research question then is, what happens when feminist ideas enter international governance discourses? And I'm going to do that using the example of the World Bank. I'm taking a Foucauldian approach to this, which is I'm actually suggesting that feminist knowledge within governance institutions becomes expertise, and expertise is a particular form of knowledge. Expertise needs to take the shape of being able to define problems and being able to suggest solutions to those problems. That's what experts are supposed to be doing. So they can do that, and they gain legitimacy by virtue of their posture of neutrality, by virtue of taking a posture of saying we are objective, we are using data. We do that all the time. I'm doing that also. WAPPP does it, I know. We talk about evidence-based policy research and things of that nature. But that's a starting point. But I think it's necessary to realize that those kinds of politics of knowledge are not politically neutral. That once knowledge becomes an instrument of government, it becomes embedded in particular governance projects. And of course, expertise also participates in politics by virtue of creating categories, by virtue of defining, by virtue of creating and generating identities. So that's the kind of politics I will be focusing on. Just to get a little sense of what I mean when I say feminist ideas. Again, this is a big simplification. But what I'm interested in this project with the World Bank is particularly the kind of ideas that have been known as the gender and development discourse. And they can be in a very simplified fashion. That discourse can be described as proposing that gender is a structuring principle of development, that it is gender relations that we need to look at. So gender does not mean women. Gender also doesn't mean men and women in this particular conceptualization, but gender points us towards looking at the relationship between men and women, and those are power relationships. And gender in development knowledge suggests that you should not, therefore, and you cannot have neutral policies that work the same way for everybody, because the world and the economy is structured in a gendered fashion. You actually need to have interventions that keep in mind what the differential impacts are on women and men of different interventions. And this is, of course, precisely those of you who are a little more familiar with this work, the suggestion that we need to mainstream gender, that we need to do gender mainstreaming, that we need to mainstream gender into all policy arenas. What's the political context I'm talking about? The political context I'm talking about, I think, in the contemporary era, is neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is one of those terms that has become the big hammer that explains everything. So I think it's useful to just tease out the different dimensions of the way in which people talk about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, on the one hand, is a doctrine. It's a doctrine that puts at the center the belief that markets should be structuring are the ideal tool for structuring our societies and our economies. Second, neoliberalism also is a political program. It's the political program that was very dominant in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. In the World Bank, it appeared as structural adjustment policies, and as such, it favored deregulation, privatization, liberalization of trade and finance. For the most part, neoliberalism as a political program has actually been criticized very heavily, and there you find very few people actually who really propose a pure form of neoliberalism in terms of programming. More importantly, perhaps, neoliberalism also is an ethos of government. And what I mean by that, it is an attitude which leads us to think that we can govern through incentives, use the market mechanism actually in order to incentivize people to do all kinds of things. In the process, there's a creation of particular forms of subjectivities. People become entrepreneurs of themselves. The idea is that we build up our own human capital and in that way conduct ourselves in the world in a fashion in which responds to various incentives that government sets. And I think this particular aspect of neoliberalism is actually one of the things that we really have inherited, and it's part of the common sense of our times, it seems to me. All right, so what is it that I actually did and what I'm in the process of doing? I have collected a bunch of materials from the World Bank, and I'm going through this very slow effort of inductively coding these materials. I started the materials in 2001, which is the publication of a report called Engendering Development, which in my mind marked the time when the bank seriously started to think about integrating gender equality issues into economic governance as opposed to education policy and health policy, which is where much of the effort was focused before that. As I'm going through my interpretation now, I'm looking at three dimensions. First, I'm going to look at the way in which feminist ideas have been integrated into neoliberal discourse, the way in which they have been instrumentalized for neoliberal discourse, the feminist critique. I will then, in a second step, look at slippages, at frictions, at contradictions, at subversions that all seems to me have to happen when you bring these types of discourses that actually don't fit together very well to begin with, when you bring them together. And then finally, I'm looking at silences, at ignorances, and here I'm following Eve Kozowski's said, which is Suggestion in Epistemology of the Closet, a book where she suggests that silences in hegemonic knowledge are an enactment of what she calls the privilege of unknowing. In other words, hegemonic knowledges can keep certain things in the closet, and it's okay, they get away with that, right? All right. Let me start with integrations or co-optations. And here I'm starting with the business case. The business case, of course, is not something that only the World Bank makes for gender equality. Any international organization that has not been set up for the purpose of promoting gender equality but has another core mission finds itself constrained to make the business case as to why they should be looking at gender equality. So most international organizations do this. So this is not unusual. The bank's business case specifically is linked to its core mission, which is poverty alleviation, and which it, of course, ties to growth and efficiency in the particular form of poverty alleviation that the bank pursues. Today, the bank actually invariably starts any publication by first saying gender equality is a development goal in its own right. So they have heard the critique that I'm just giving you. They then go on and say, but it's also smart economics, and then the publication focuses on smart economics. In this particular quote, which is from the Gender Action Plan, let me just read this. I know it's a longish, ugly slide, so let me just talk you through it. Gains in women's economic opportunities lag behind those in women's capabilities. This is inefficient. So the issue is efficiency, since increased women's labor force participation and earnings are associated with reduced poverty and faster growth. So our goal is poverty alleviation, growth. Women will benefit from their economic empowerment, so it's a win-win. Right? It's going to be good for women also, but so too will men, children, and society as a whole. Women's lack of economic empowerment, on the other hand, not only imperils growth and poverty reduction, there they are again, but also has a host of other negative impacts, including less favorable education and health outcomes for children, and more rapid spread of HIV/AIDS. So there are all these other goals that the bank needs to pursue, and that it is pursuing by saying we can get at all of this if we look at gender inequality. So let me make a few comments on that. To begin with, if I juxtapose this with the gender and development approach, one of the striking things is that the bank just reverses the logic here. I mean, the gender and development people have been saying for a long time, modernization, development is bad for women, has hurt women. No, it's not bad for women, but has hurt women, right? So women, have been cheated out of land, women have, technology gets introduced and women lose jobs on the farms, and this is Esther Bothrop's work, and what has continued on that structural adjustment has hurt women, right? The bank has never bought that, right? Has never really latched onto that. Has always questioned it. But essentially, what they're doing here is they're saying, well, it doesn't really matter. You know, that's not the conversation we're going to have anymore. Let's reverse the argument. Gender equality is good for development. So now the terms of the discourse are shifted entirely. So by reversing the logic, this gets kind of defanged, that whole debate. Now, there's another politics to the case. The first problem there is, of course, that there's a symbolic message that is being sent when we say, well, gender equality is secondary to virtually everything else, right? And I find that problematic in itself. But maybe, this outweighs the benefits to be had from the business case. A second issue I think to be concerned about, and this is Esther Duflo suggested that it's actually really risky to make that kind of an argument. She said, well, what if it's actually not true? And here, going through bank literature, while on the surface the slogan is gender equality is smart economics, and the bank has put a lot of money into making that case in terms of funding research, the research actually is not all that straightforward. Let me give you a few quotes. One from a working paper in 2007. Although micro-level effects of gender equality on individual productivity and human development outcomes have been well documented and have important ramifications for aggregate economic performance, establishing the empirical relationship between gender equality and poverty reduction and growth at the macro level has proven to be more challenging. or from another publication in a book on macroeconomics and gender in 2011, the results from the empirical studies fall into three categories. A number of studies show a positive relationship between gender equality and economic growth, suggesting a win-win scenario. Improving gender equality improves growth and vice versa. At the other end of the spectrum are studies that posit a positive relationship between gender inequality and economic growth, a lose-win scenario. In between are studies that examine facets of gender discrimination that act as a brake on economic growth. Once these problems are remedied, economic growth ensues. So clearly, I mean, this is, once you look into the research being done at the bank, you find what you find in any other research arena, which is that people have all kinds of different findings about these issues, and the issue becomes a lot more complex. Now, the third item that I want to point to here with regard to the politics of the business case is to suggest that it also is pernicious in the sense that it actually narrows our imagination. It narrows the kind of imagination that we can put to feminist politics. In particular, people have talked about how issues of reproduction and care labor and policies of childcare are often very marginal to what is being talked about, when presumably they are quite central in feminist politics, but they are very rarely addressed in World Bank publications, that there's heteronormative commitments to the kind of policies that are being implemented, to the kind of talk that is perpetuated where gender is always women and men, that policies that movements pursue, such as rape prevention, for example, is entirely outside the picture of what will bring about gender equality in this particular discourse. All right, so here the business case seems to me provides evidence for integration. I want to talk about problem definition a little bit next, which I think also points us towards more of an integration or co-optation of feminist ideas into World Bank discourse. What's the problem? Now, experts need to define what the problem is, and Carol Bucky goes so far to say that much of the policy process is actually about problem definition. That much of, and in many instances, the problem definition is, of course, intensely linked or entirely, very tightly linked to solutions. And in many instances, solutions may even precede the problem. Arguably, that's the case with neoliberalism, where we know the market is the solution. So therefore, we need to kind of identify the problem that goes with that particular solution. Now, in my codings, not surprisingly, the problem definition in bank documents is gender inequality, which is not rocket science. We hardly ever think about that term. We use it all the time. The prescription in gender mainstreaming is the goal should be the elimination of gender inequality. It's the language we use. But that's not really the only problem definition that's out there. If you go into feminist history, history of feminist thought, there's talk about women's oppression, there's talk about gender subordination, there's talk about patriarchy, there's talk about gender injustice. If you look at post-structuralist feminists, they talk about the productivity of gender. So it's different ways in which this issue could be framed. Along with problem definitions go a certain understanding of the causes of the problem. So the causes of the problem then become discrimination, which is often measured in gaps and disparities. But there are also, and this is something that surprised me a little bit, how prevalent that was in the documents. I ended up with a number of codes that were all about lack of. So there was a lack of access to credit, a lack of jobs, a lack of land, a lack of assets, a lack of networks, and all of that then adds up to a lack of economic opportunities. So women somehow lack all these things. The definition goes a little bit in the direction of certain deficiencies being identified, and then of course, and this is again expertise doing its work, once you have identified deficiencies, governments know they have to intervene and they need to rectify somehow these lacks through empowerment and those things that we talk about in development discourse. Okay, now the lack of economic opportunity, I think, is something that is important to talk about here in particular, because once economic opportunity is identified as the main lack, and it is the recurring lack, everything usually kind of ends up being funneled towards the language of economic opportunity. Essentially what is made central here then again is the market. It's the opportunity to participate in the market. And in essence, there's underlying this a definition of gender inequality as meaning economic opportunities, which gets us back to the feminist discussions about should we worry about opportunities or outcomes. And the bank is having this discussion actually going on internally, which I found really interesting. And this is kind of, in a way, I'm starting to talk about slippages here. This is where the first slippage occurs. There's on the one hand the 2001 Engendering Development Report, which very explicitly says we shall stop short of defining gender equality as equality of outcomes for two reasons. First, different cultures and societies can follow different paths in their pursuit of gender equality. Second, equality implies that women and men are free to choose different or similar roles and different or similar outcomes in accordance with their preferences and goals. I should have put that up there because it's a complicated quote. But let me just walk you through that. So the first argument is, well, there's different cultures in society, and they may have different paths to gender equality. I actually don't find this a logical argument, because that actually would suggest that they should be looking at outcomes rather than at the path, which is economic opportunities. The second argument is a little more interesting, right? So equality implies that women and men are free to choose different or similar roles or different and similar outcomes in accordance with their preferences and goals. So the assumption here is, under conditions of equal opportunity, if you still have unequal outcomes, it's because people wanted it. It was a matter of preferences. It was a matter of goals. What's the problem with that? I mean, something seems wrong with that. The problem, I think, is that they have no idea, or that they had no way in this argument to account for women's difference. In the more recent World Development Report, these women's differences is recognized, and they're picking up on some of the literature on differences in women's risk aversion, differences in social preferences, differences in attitudes about competition that I think have come up in the economic literature. And they're saying, well, if those differences really exist, then we can't really just talk about equality of opportunities. Moreover, and there's some sociologists in those gender units in the bank, and they're saying, actually it's these outcomes and the difference in power relations that also produce different preferences. So, if you have no power, if you live in a situation where you're very deprived, it really actually affects the way in which you imagine what you could want. This is very new. This is very different from any of the ideas of kind of an abstract, rationally choosing individual conducting himself in the market. So there's a real slippages happening here. And the World Development Report very specifically then ends this argument saying, despite this debate about whether equality means opportunities or outcomes, it is difficult in practice to measure opportunities separately from outcomes. Indeed, equality of opportunities and equality of outcomes are tightly linked in theory and in measurement. So let's do away with this. All right, let me talk about a few more slippages. This was already.
Can I ask you a question
Yeah.
about why you call it slippage? Meaning, would you argue that an organization has to be coherent over time, or would it be permissible to say this is an evolution?
Yeah.
In the World Bank, that actually is totally correlated with the evolution of economic theory. In those 10 years.
Yeah.
So for me, this is not particularly surprising that you find a difference, 10 years later. So that's why I'm asking, why is it a slippage? Couldn't we allow organizations to learn and do things differently?
Absolutely. What I'm presenting to you here is the discursive argument. So I'm approaching this through an analysis of two types of discourses, which I imagine as relatively, or introduced as relatively static. So the assumption here is, okay, we have a strong neoliberal commitments, which you still have in the bank, in kind of not in the gender corner, but in the office of the head economist and so on. I mean that's really what dominates, and so I'm imagining this. It's a portrayal, right, of what is happening with a particular discourse. A very different way of approaching this would be saying, let's use an organizational theory, and let's see what happens in terms of organizational processes. I haven't done that work, so that's why you hear what you hear here. And I'd be interested actually in talking more with you about that, as to how to conceptualize that also, because to me that then becomes a matter of mechanisms. Okay, so slippage, let's call it that. Slippage number one focuses around institutions. The bank has actually quite for some time been interested in institutions now, in particular in the context of the good governance agenda, which actually came up in the context of neoliberal ideas. So the neoliberal good governance agenda entailed that one would create efficient markets, and you needed to have the right institutions in place in order to create efficient markets. Critics have called this a way for constitutionalizing the rights of capital, but it seems to me that the focus on institutions opened up all kinds of other areas that one could think about when one talks about institutions, and some people indeed have suggested that focusing on human rights is an element of good governance. The Gender Action Plan is very specific on that. They say we should not just be creating efficient markets, we need to be creating equitable markets. It's markets that work for women is what we want to create. And so as a result, and we had Sarah Iqbal here a few weeks ago, the project on women, business and the law is precisely in this area. What is really surprising, seems to me, about what the women are doing in this area, and they're all women in that office, is that they do not just focus on formal institutions, but they also have branched out in all kinds of ways. So it's to begin with not just about instituting good markets in the narrow sense, through business registration law, labor law, and so on, but in order to have a functioning equitable market, you now also need to have equitable family laws, equitable inheritance laws. You extend this logic into the private sphere that typically has been seen as quite a far away from markets, including laws against domestic violence and laws on sexual harassment, which I think is really quite subversive to talk about it in this way. And then furthermore, There is talk about informal institutions, gender roles, beliefs, social norms, and networks, although I have to say that, that the kinds of references I see to that, the bank is very nervous about intervening in this area, as they probably shouldn't. I think that's probably good that they're nervous about that. And the argument they're making is that, well, once you get the formal institutions changed and once you have the economic opportunities in place, it's actually surprising how fast these informal institutions are changing, which I think is an interesting argument, and I would like to see the empirics of that. But it's a research agenda, I think, actually, really about how does change happen, theories of change. Okay, so institutions, serious slippages here. Endowments. This is another area that surprised me a little bit. Amartya Sen's capabilities approach is very often associated as something that UNDP does, whereas the World Bank does neoliberal economics. Well, that's certainly not the case when the bank talks about gender issues. It has very firmly embraced in that context the capabilities approach. It's about making it possible for women to participate in markets, and they're thinking there of again, not as the abstract rational man participating in market or human being, which is, you know, it's kind of the same thing, and you know, the bank lingo. But they actually really think of human beings as being embodied, as having endowments, as coming with having different endowments, and I think that's the important thing, as having different resources, as having different, being healthy in different ways, having different kinds of education. And again, this matters, right, because it matters for the kind of prescriptions you come up with. And prescriptions that are in the world development, some of the prescriptions are really surprising. You know, there's a talk about investment, more investment into health and into clean water and so on. So there is kind of a little bit of a stepping back from that logic that drove structural adjustment policies, which was all about let the market figure this out and having private provision of these public goods. They are really stepping back there, and they're calling on state programs, which are costly, to provide some of these things. Then finally, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm a little nervous talking about that because I haven't wrapped my mind entirely around what's going on here. There is recently in the bank a new term that has popped up. It's the term agency. And it's a little unclear what that actually is, even though there's books about it. There's at least 2 books about it. It appears in the World Development Report. And there seems to be an internal discussion going on, from what I can gather. So you have on the one hand the people that try to link agency, make it kind of akin to choice. It's something that you do in the market. So this is a preface where one of the bank VPs is invited to comment, and I forget whether it was a he or she, says the power by agency is the power and opportunity to take risks, seize opportunities, and shape one's lives. So we have it latched back to markets and economic opportunities. But when you listen to the gender experts talking, and the second quote here is one from one of my fellows here, Jenny Klugman, it's the capacity to make decisions about one's own life and act on them to achieve a desired outcome, free of violence, retribution, or fear. There's absolutely nothing about economic opportunity in this particular quote. It's just it's about power, right? It's about being empowered, being powerful. And then there's another gender expert's definition, and she actually suggests this is the power for self-definition. And here what she actually is referring to is that there's got to be an element of critique in there. One has to be able to reflect on one's own life because, and this is the example she provides, if a woman says that it's right for her husband to beat her if she burns the food or whatever, then I don't call that agency. Basically, agency requires that you have the power to reflect on those relationships and be able to critique them. And, there is things about collective organization and supporting collective organization, and all of these ideas start to pop up in these books, really, really far removed from the narrow framing of gender equality as equal opportunity. Now, silences. Macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is a taboo subject for gender. We had that whole contestation as to whether, on the one hand, that the argument is gender equality is good for growth, but it really, gender expertise remains at the level of microeconomics. In the World Development Report and in other publications, modernization is not questioned, growth is not questioned, globalization is not questioned. The Gender Action Plan puts it as follows: sound macroeconomic policy, responsive governance, a favorable business climate, and the openness and accountability of institutions also affect outcomes for women and men, but they mostly operate beyond the influence of this action plan. The bank does not embrace the feminist critiques of macroeconomics, of macroeconomic biases. Instead, what you actually often find there in the literature also is a reversal of logics. In the book of macroeconomics and gender, they do review that literature, the feminist critique of macroeconomics, but then most of the book actually reverses the logic again. They say, well, people are saying structural adjustment is bad for women, but then it goes on to say, well, let's see how do gender dynamics at the household level affect savings, affect consumption, affect investment, and so on. So again, this is an area that is apparently entirely off limits. Now, let me conclude. So what happens to feminist ideas when they enter neoliberal development discourse? The answers I know ahead of time, but I hope I've also shown to you convincingly that there is integration and there is instrumentalization, that there's slippages, but there's also silences. Now, is there something to be taken away from that, right? Going back to this argument between feminism triumphed or feminism tamed, it seems to me that gender mainstreaming, the idea of integrating gender into development institutions, has been both a failure and a success. It can be both. I think we need to recognize that the world doesn't change because of our designs necessarily, but perhaps that history gets its impetus from the knowledges and powers we participate in validating. This is a different way of thinking about change, right? Assuming that the discourses are out there and we can choose to participate in not just one or the other, but participate in them in various ways. And I think as a final recommendation, I guess it would leave me with recalling how important it is to remain critical, how important it is to have movements involved in many of these government projects and have critical voices on the outside. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take critiques, questions, suggestions.
Jump in, nobody else. So I have a question about, goes back to the slippages and the diversity of also feminist logics, right? So could one argue that, just a couple thoughts, but one, I'll just start with, could one argue, like going back to Iris was kind of talking about, the World Bank is taking, the changes there, well, one could argue that some of the changes that you were describing as slippages from the neoliberal model might be traced by a separate path simply through development. So rather than actually as a leaking of feminist thought into economics, some of it could just be explained, frankly, by developments in economic theory. In the sort of community of economists that evolutions or generations in the theory of economy, in the community of economists who sort of defined the sort of neoliberal philosophy theory originally. So that's one possibility. But so along the lines of these, like, what are the paths by which these kind of slippages or logics are occurring? And again, I wonder, like, if you go back to the diversity of logics within feminist theory, I mean, is there a chance that it's really liberal feminists who are influencing this discourse, as opposed to, more critical theorists, and that's part of what you're seeing, and that the disconnect is really is that they're just selecting within the community of feminists those that make the most sense to them.
Yeah. I think that's entirely correct.
Okay.
The other issue on what are the paths in which this happens, that's a much more tricky issue.
Yeah.
Because can you where do you put the causality? I mean, one of the problems there is actually that the bank has become so big in terms of research it does on development economics that it's basically the largest development economics department in the world. I mean, there's a huge amount of money that goes in there, and there's, of course, development economists move back and forth, and they entirely have the conversation going on. So the bank, in a sense, there's the internal, external is very difficult to distinguish on this. I mean, I'd be really interested in talking more about the institutional processes with both of you, actually. That's something you have talked about more extensively.
My comment is not going to be about institutional processes, but a way for you maybe to look at other evidence. Is this just happening in the gender domain in the World Bank, or in other domains as well? So again, my gut instinct tells. So, for example, the next Human Development Report is going to focus on behavioral economics, which has nothing, very little to do with neoliberal thought. And I mean, the two big revolutions, if I may call them, that happened in econ in the last 10 years were behavioral and empirical. So data now drives everything, and this is not just experiments, but experiments play an important role, but also big data, different ways of analyzing data. And in my naive perception of comparing the two reports, and I also like 2012 much, much better than the 2001, is that reflects kind of that evolution in the bank more generally. Now it might have, might be other things. I don't know, you can trace that, right? That's very hard. There's also different authors, and I happen to know both groups of authors. They're very, very different people, trained at different places. But that's kind of my best gut feeling. But I wanted to make another comment or question, and that's a bit more pragmatic. I think for economists, including myself, that distinction between equality and efficiency is kind of really huge. And not because of feminist theory reasons, but also for pragmatic reasons. Because kind of the interventions that we have to think about to decrease gender inequality, to go with that term, are very, very different, depending on whether I think it's a zero-sum game, and everything I win is some man's loss, is a very different way of kind of analyzing the problem, but also intervening in the problem, kind of trying, compared to there are efficiency gains to be had. I think that's why you see so much action in that space of really trying to see, is there a business case, and when is there one, and when isn't there one, and because it will affect kind of the policy recommendations that people like I or other economists would give. So that's not a comment on why it's so important for economists. That question is so critically important.
But can economists actually make the equality argument? I mean, is it?
What do you mean?
Do you have the instruments to say that equitable institutions do you not in the end always have to have your argument always goes back to efficiency, right? I mean, because if the market is the starting point.
Wage inequality is a big, inequality, particularly at the Kennedy School, of course, is a huge theme. Many economists in social policy here work only on inequality, not on efficiency at all. So I think, I think take the gender wage gap,
Mhm.
right? That's all about inequality. One could then argue, maybe you can make an extension that it might also have efficiency consequences, but that's really only about inequality. And I think many economists have inequality as their dependent variable. Our current dean, that's all he did. So yes, there is a very strong school, I think, which just focuses on inequality and decreasing inequality.
And I think then that comes into play in where theory ends and then how it's going to be used. Economists can bound the argument and can stop at saying it would make it more equal. But if you want to be able to sell that in a way that it will have uptake,
Right.
what gets sold, in essence, and therefore what gets uptake, is going to be highly contingent upon where stakeholders in different arenas can sense value that's already aligned.
Right.
And since virtually all policy is going to end up needing to be turned into dollars and cents, because everything has a budget attached to it, and that's where the rubber meets the road with policy. Regardless of just what the discourse is, the pressures which are required for uptake push it into an efficiency lens. If you wanted to go from pure to outcome.
Well, in a sense, that's exactly my argument,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that why is it that when economists apparently also make the pure equality argument, that is not good enough, right? That you have to turn it into this dollar and cent.
Because
type
otherwise
of-
it's just an argument of thought, right?
No, there is a value in equality, no? Or is there only value in...
Because the economists or WAPPP or feminists generally, it is difficult to construct without resources. Right?
Yes.
So when feminists have to move from the intellectual role of constructing what the world should look like to building coalitions to create what the world should look like, even people who are equally invested in the pure equality argument, you have to put a price tag. And since most of the conversations, for example, that take place here and as an extension of here, that price tag is going to end up being paid by business or being paid by government. Both are resource constrained. So then, you see what I'm saying?
I see entirely what
I'm
you're
not
saying,
pleased
but
about it,
right.
But I'm highly aware of it.
But it seems to me it's also pernicious that in those calculations we are making, that we can't put value on anything but, or that we can't, that we have to measure everything, every value, which we know there's many values, that we have to translate all those values into monetary values.
And I don't mean to imply that.
I know that's not what
Yeah,
you mean.
but
Right.
that's not what I'm
Right. So there's another argument there. Yeah.
We're sort of like just in another
Yeah,
world.
It seems to me that the slippages that you refer to, which are really interesting, actually go quite against this argument, right? So it's almost as if, and this goes back to the organizational question, it's almost as if the organization takes a stance, and the stance is around a neoliberal sort of view of the world. And yet, the folks, and I mean, you talk about, we have sociologists here, we have women here, the folks that actually do the work that they want to do. And so the slippage seems to be a very common organizational slippage. And this goes back to Iris's point that you may want to compare this to other things that the bank is doing. There's likely across every agenda that you have, or every agenda
Right.
item that you have, a lot of slippage between the bank's stance on it and the reports that go out and the practices in place. Because the practices in place are carried out by people who may or may not have the same set of values. And
I mean,
I don't think that's necessarily about feminism.
Right. Well, I think, no, it's not actually, and it's surprising how few people who do gender expertise actually self-identify as feminists, which doesn't go together at all. What I'm also asking myself, I think there's different reports have different status. So when there is a working paper, it has a different status than the World Development Report. the World Development Report has gone through massive vetting, because it really is quoted then as the World Bank says, as opposed to some World Bank researchers says. And so I think that difference is really quite crucial. The other part is, yes, to what extent is that actually being mainstreamed into country assistance strategies or into what the bank is doing in terms of when it interacts with clients. That's another element in it. I think the idea of comparison is quite interesting. And I think my inclination would be to actually do it around environmental politics. Because I think that's comparable. It's probably a little more salient, and there's more money behind it now than behind the gender issue. But I think in terms of it being something that kind of disrupts a neoliberal framework, it has a similar status. Noella.
A few comments that I have. I was just writing many of them here, but so something on perhaps on the discursive aspect and then on the constructive aspect of the argument. So first, so it's a discourse to whom? I mean, I was missing like perhaps in the entire point. I mean, like who are the stakeholders and the audience, and doesn't this help explaining why it is the way it is? And so as I put it here, I mean, so gender inclusion is usually instrumentalized for the overarching goals. That's a bit of the argument that we have there. And okay, it's not like gender equality per se, but gender equality because it solves A, B, and C. And I mean, at least part of what we understand as neoliberalism is this understanding, okay, we're going to solve what we can solve, and the other things will get solved automatically, or they will get prioritized automatically. It's a bit of how we see it. So isn't this, like, even putting gender there at least a way of an attempt of trying to get around it? I mean, okay, fine, we know that this is in place, so can we get around it? And then, like, it goes further in the sense that, and then that's the constructive part. I mean, I'm not, like, being very clear, but so this is what the World Bank puts out there, and this in a way helps explaining or helps forming the way we are going to see gender equality further, right? So this is kind of the mindset that we have in mind now when we think of gender equality, and these are the options that we have, like in global governance. So like, so like how we build from that, because in a way like this helps building what will come next. Even the critique is a bit slightly built by what is put out there. I mean, like, what are the actual avenues for doing it differently, considering that we have to target these audiences that are not willing necessarily to hear about gender because they're not necessarily interested about gender to start with. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I understood everything. We have to have a conversation, right?
Not coherent.
But just one comment on the audience issue. I mean, if you're a pure Foucauldian, the audience is kind of irrelevant because the discourse is out there and it does its thing, and it invokes you whether you want to or not, and you become its mouth, right? So it talks through you, and it pops up in all kinds of corners. I mean, so we think we're talking to a particular audience, but guess what? There's all kinds of other people who are reading it too. Right?
I know. That's why it's had a wider audience, and that's why I separated like stakeholders and a wider audience.
Yes.
Because of course, like it gets caught up by many other people who are not the intended. Like,
exactly.
audience.
And the argument then is precisely, and I think you said that also. That's your presumption also. I mean, that basically creates path dependencies. Is that how you would say it? Yeah. I mean, it structures the solutions that become imaginable in the aftermath. Yes.
So Elisabeth, thank you for this. I have often thought about the business case and about sort of the gender and development language used around gender equality as sort of the most pragmatic approach from a feminist perspective, right? Like, get what you can. And in a more crude way, I think of it as sort of the feminists deal with the neoliberal devil, right? Where
Yeah.
we get what we can. They put women on things, they say it
Right.
matters, they do certain things that alleviate certain problems for certain people. But I think what none of us are raising here is sort of what's lost, right? Because while there was never a pure moment in feminism, there was in the past and continues to be large, robust strains of feminism that argue for universal economic justice, right? Every person out of poverty, as opposed to every person with the chance to apply for a low-wage job.
Right.
And when we agree, when we allow sort of neoliberal discourses to take up the parts of feminism that work for them, I think part of what you mean by validating is that it strengthens the legitimacy of those discourses.
Yes.
And I think that what we trade, that maybe we didn't mean to, and maybe we thought we'd come back for, was the opportunity to argue in a very robust way for more universal rights. As you said, with violence against women, right? The business case can't fix that, right? And I would, this is hypothetical, this is a hypothesis of what will happen, but if we achieve the business case, businesses are efficient and women are able to participate and their talents are used, I would posit that they will still go home and get beaten. And I think we should all, those of us who engage in this sort of work, it's important work. We have to fix the institutions that we have. But I think we always have to remember that we're doing what we can and not exactly what we aspire to.
That's very beautifully said. I could have never done it this way. Thank you very much. There's just one caveat, and I'm having second thoughts about that, because you know, the business case now includes actually fighting violence against women.
Yeah, I actually have a whole piece I do on that.
Yeah.
And got a really nice bill without my WAPPP hat on, passed. I mean, because you can actually quantify lost wages, lost productivity.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the concession that
But-
No, it's a
we
huge
should
concession,
have
yeah.
everyone creating as much profit as possible at all times, as
Exactly.
opposed to a world in which everyone has a chance to live.
That's the point, right?
Yeah.
That's the payoff, right? And we may even address violence against women's issues as long as a certain form of economic governance continues. Yeah. Carrie.
Well, Danielle just blew that out of the water. And I wanted to talk about something similar, so I will go to the next sort of part of that. Once organizations then have a platform using the business case and sort of have those inroads, what are some opportunities you see them that they could take advantage of to also advance this more, feminist theory and feminist sort of support? If they're already in through that door, what would you suggest that they do in addition to sort of widen that language they're using?
I'd like to answer that by not answering you, because I think in the end, when I have done work that starts not from the top, but from the bottom, and this is some of the work I did on agricultural policy in the European Union and running around in East Germany in the countryside. People there, and those are administrators in local EU-funded projects, right? Administrators there knew that they were supposed to be doing something about women, right? They had no idea what gender mainstreaming is, or what gender means, or gender relations, or men and women, or is it just women, or whatnot. All that arrived at that level was noise, right? And they took that noise and they used it to argue for what in this particular community they had, there was kind of a resurgence of neo-Nazis, and they linked it to women leaving the countryside. There was like the proportion of 100 men to 90 women in the East German countryside. And so they said, our goal has to be, first priority is to create jobs for women so the women stay here. And that became their priority. And so in a sense, all the institution the European Union did for them is create the noise with all the logic and thinking and theories that went into that in Brussels and whatnot, and it trickled down in some fashion. But then it actually made it possible for these people to define their own needs and their own projects and what needed to happen in the community. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, in the more abstract is, let's not get too obsessed about the institutions, because they're just one element of this whole big picture. And more than anything, I think they need to give room to local organizations, to civil society organizations, to women's organizations, to come in and to participate in that change process that has happened. And they have to send the right noises, right? Not any noise will do. They have to send the right noises. But I'm not actually all that persuaded that in the end it matters all that much how right it is. I mean, all the stuff I just ran you through. Which is a little depressing to think about, I guess.
Yeah, I have a question about how this knowledge comes into existence. So you refer to the data and literature they read, but also that they don't identify as feminists themselves. Is there a feminist lobby going around? Are they in contact with feminist movements? And is there also an opening for critical organizations to express their concerns to the World Bank?
And that's a really interesting question. You know, I think there is a real shift that has happened. I mean, we had that whole feminist literature on femocrats, right? That established themselves in Australia and Europe. They're all over the place. And many of those women actually do self-identify as feminists. I think that gender has been institutionalized to such an extent that the people that I talk to, I wouldn't call them femocrats, because they really were often hired because they were in the organization. You needed to run a model and they needed to plug in gender as a variable, and so they got onto that, and they quite a few of the people I did in interviews said, well, I don't actually really think of myself as a gender expert, even though they appeared as one of the people that provided input in the World Development Report and produced knowledge on gender. Even the people that are in the gender office, they would say, I would never call myself a feminist in the bank, but yeah, probably I'm a feminist. It's just not an issue for them. They, to them, I mean, the point is that I think the movement is relatively far removed from them. There are some organizations in Washington, that Women's Eyes on the World Bank. There's another project. I interviewed her as well. But they're one-women shows. They're relatively small. They're small networks. The bank has made a point of doing extensive consultations all the time. So around the World Development Report, they actually had consultations around the world where they also invited feminist researchers. And there's people who have written about those consultations and about what has been taken up and what hasn't been taken up. So there's a real effort to reach out, and the conversation is going on between people who are self-identified feminists. But I think there's really this professionalization of gender expertise that is a totally different phenomenon, and that really becomes then where gender becomes expertise. It becomes a different thing. Yes?
Hi, Cara Matthews. And
Hi.
My question is really just to follow up on you mentioned one of your colleagues said that it's really difficult to measure opportunity, or one of the scholars that you pointed to, and kind of bringing the whole piece and agency into it. What are the best sort of measures that are out there, barometers for opportunity? Because I think it's particularly relevant in this country, where it's sort of, that's the beacon of hope, is that there's equal opportunity for everyone. And really, how have we measured it, and how do we measure where we are as a country, particularly when this is not just exclusive to gender, but in this country, race relations and immigration and everything. So I think it's particularly important that we start to realize the best way to measure opportunities, so that we can strive to have equal opportunities for all of us. Because I think you're absolutely right that it's really a universal access thing, that we're really living our optimal experience when our brothers and sisters are living out their optimal experience. And as long as we can start to build up our communities that way, stop fragmenting groups, but realize we're all people. And so I think just sort of getting the best barometer for
Yeah.
measuring opportunity for all of us.
You're asking the wrong person. I'm totally, now that I have read so much about opportunities, I'm totally confused about what that is. I thought it was the most obvious thing. But I don't know how you measure that. How do you see an opportunity when you see it? And I think it's telling that basically the bank, the World Development Report comes up to say, well, you really you have to measure it through outcomes. You can't measure, it's a theoretical concept in the end. I'm glad you're nodding. That was my conclusion, no?
No, I agree. I mean,
You agree?
I think it goes back to the question that you talked about before. I mean, the bank's approach used to be equal access, equal rights, etc. And then if women and men choose different things, it's due to preferences, right? That has dramatically changed in the last 10 years. Now saying, but these preferences are not exogenous, they're endogenous, and they're shaped by a ton of things, and if women are less self-confident than men, that shouldn't have come across as negative. That just means differences in self-confidence. And differences in risk preferences, differences in lots of different things, then equal opportunity in the sense of access is almost meaningless. Not completely meaningless, but almost meaningless. So if we have equal, we have suffrage, but if only 40% of women vote, then we probably have to dig deeper of why are women not voting? Is there something going on there? And so the opportunity as right, defined only by rights, clearly doesn't give us the whole answer. I'm not saying rights aren't important. I think we shouldn't give up rights. Rights are probably the first most important step, but then there's many, many more we have to take.
And that's the behavioral revolution, right? That referred to there, for that to happen?
Excuse me?
For that to have happened, that's kind of the behavioral economics revolution?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
I mean, there's a certain, this is a little bit of a kind of wild suggestion, but just to throw it out for brainstorming, like you could almost write this paper in the reverse. So rather than example of how like critical theory, which I understand you're initially arguing, you're sort of looking at how critical theory has influenced the World Bank, but I think you could almost argue you could almost use this in the inverse. It's just to say, how has the evolution of kind of economic theory approached critical theory? Let me use as an example the case of gender, because I mean there's a certain degree of there is like one thing that my limited understanding of critical theory, there is this sort of radical subjectivism within critical theory, the sort of the social construction of the reality as we experience it, and within psychology, which has been like kind of the source of this behavioral revolution, there is actually a kind of, even though they use liberal methods of discovery or experimental methods, etc., sort of make certain statistical assumptions that would be critiqued by critical theorists, they have a sort of fundamentally radical subjectivist theoretical foundation. And so what you have is this kind of radical subjectivism leaking into economics. So, I mean, I really wonder about the extent to which you're actually just having a kind of rapprochement. I mean, it might not even be triumphant and tamed, it may be literally that these like two, the other is becoming diminished. If critical theory defined itself, so I know there's a lot of discussion about the other in critical theory, you may have a diminishment of the other. If the other is like, liberal thought in essence. Yeah. That other is actually becoming more like the self. Yeah. And that's there's a story there, and you can explore it through gender. Yeah.
It's interesting. I obviously need to read more into economics, I realize. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned UNDP at some point in terms of different perspective on development. If you looked at the literature in the bank in comparison with other organizations, and if the Millennium Development Goals had some shaking up on the gender. At some point everybody was writing gender in it, just to make sure that everybody was on the same page. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's exactly what I'm going to do next month. As a matter of fact, originally this talk was announced as World Bank and UNDP, and I snuck into Aisha's office and said, could you please take that out? I don't know. So yes, great suggestion.
Perfect place to lead it. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thought-provoking preservation. Please, our next session is in 2 weeks on Thursday, November 13th, because of the I don't know why, if it's not because of the holiday. But it's Joe Baylor, professor of mathematics education at Stanford, and the founder of UCubed, is going to talk about paying the price for sugar and spice, how girls and women are kept out of mathematics and science. So.
Some people have the best time.